This video we talk about supply, and if you've just seen the lecture on demand, much of this is the same. Only we need to keep in mind that demand, usually when we talk about demand, we're talking about households and consumers, right? But with supply, we're talking about firms and producers. So it's just the other side of the economy. But we do need to distinguish between supply and quantity supplied, and movements and shifts, and we need to consider what are those types of things that can cause a movement and shift. Well, you might be able to guess. Let me come back to that. So here we have a supply schedule, and just as before, we plot the points and then connect them. We're going to be assuming straight line supply curves. And what do you suppose is the single thing that can cause a movement along the supply curve, the coffee supply curve? A change in the price of coffee. So a change in the price of coffee, say from $4 to $6, will cause us to move from here to here. Or if price goes up from $6 to $7, we move from point A to point B. And so a change in the price of coffee is the only thing that can cause a movement along the coffee supply curve. But if anything else changes, it will cause a shift in the supply curve. And generally when we're talking about the supply shifters, they're all things that relate to the production of coffee. So moving ahead, I'll just quickly mention this figure 3.9. Again, you see here we have a different supply schedule. So something happened. One thing that could have happened is the weather was very favorable in coffee growing regions. And so they have a bunch of coffee now. They grew more coffee than they otherwise would have. And so now, at a price of $4, coffee suppliers or producers are willing to supply 25 million pounds. Whereas before, they were only willing to supply 15. You see the exact same information here in the schedule, right? At a price of $4, before they were willing to supply 15 million pounds, but after the good weather, they were willing to supply 25 pounds. So that is an example of a supply shifter and a shift, an increase in supply. You can also have a reduction in supply. For example, if the weather is not favorable, but unfavorable, then you'll see that if there's less coffee, right, due to the bad weather, at a price of $4, suppliers will only be willing to sell maybe 5 million pounds. So now we'll talk about the supply shifters. The price of factors of production. So for example, if the wage rate goes up, that means labor is more expensive. That's going to cause the supply to shift. And it will shift to the left. Why to the left? Because at any given price, people will be willing to supply less coffee. Right? The returns from alternative activities, for example, maybe rather than growing coffee, maybe something happens like the price of some other kind of bean goes up, and so coffee farmers decide to rip up their coffee plants and put in some other plant. That could cause supply curve to change. Technology, if the technology for growing or maybe roasting or brewing or any aspect of coffee production changes, could cause a shift in the supply for coffee. And again, expectations can cause shifts in the supply of coffee. And we have already been mentioning weather in this video. Natural events are also possible supply shifters. I would say generally the things to keep in mind for supply are if it affects the production of the good, it's going to cause the supply to shift. If it affects the production negatively, then the curve is going to shift to the left. If it affects the production positively, the curve is going to shift to the right. That's your best bet for keeping track of these supply shifters. But for the demand shifters we mentioned in the previous video, you should actually make the list, right? Tastes, price of related goods, income, and there were a couple other ones. I think it's a little bit more difficult to keep track of these supply shifters here because some of them are maybe not as don't clearly belong to one category or the other. And just as before we had this heads up about movements and shifts, I've been saying it throughout the last 2 videos. The only thing that causes a movement along the curve is a change in the price of that good. But if anything else happens, it will cause the curves to shift. And of course, if something happens that dramatically affects producing the good, it will cause it to shift in a big way. Right? If a butterfly flaps its wings halfway around the world, it might cause the curve to shift, but you probably won't be able to notice, right? So it has to be something that's big enough, like the weather was really bad, for it to cause the whole entire curve to shift in a noticeable way. This case in point article has to do with a business that has gone from producing various goods and services, and I'll leave it for you to read and to connect the concepts discussed in the video with the case.